Ethan Trellick had never felt so small in his entire life, and considering his 5'7" frame had been the butt of jokes throughout graduate school, that was saying something. The Varelian 9 intergalactic stations stretched before him like a chrome-plated fever dream, all swooping architecture and impossible angles that made his human brain itch. It wasn't the station size that was making him feel like a misplaced decimal point in the grand universal equation, though. It was the other life forms. Sweet, merciful Einstein, he muttered, clutching his tablet like a shield as a being that resembled a sentient crystal formation glided past. The crystal entity was the size of a minivan and hummed at a frequency that made Ethan's fillings vibrate. They didn't cover this in orientation. The station's welcoming hall, a term Ethan found increasingly ironic, was essentially a massive cafeteria where representatives from across the known galaxies could meet, mingle, and size each other up, often literally. In the center of the room, a 12-foot-tall avian creature with iridescent feathers was engaged in what appeared to be a friendly conversation with something that looked like a genetically modified squid wearing a business suit. The squid thing was even taller. Ethan's credentials as Earth's newest xenosociologist had gotten him this posting, but his doctorate suddenly felt about as useful as a paper umbrella in a supernova. His assignment was simple on paper: observe cross-species interactions and document emerging social patterns in this interstellar melting pot. The committee that had selected him had called it groundbreaking research. Now, surrounded by beings that could probably eat him as an amuse-bouche, ground was exactly where Ethan feared he'd end up, specifically ground in a paste. Human Ethan Trellick, welcome to Varelian 9 Station, announced a pleasant, genderless voice from somewhere above. I am Sevi, the station's enhanced virtual intelligence. Your quarters are prepared in the Terra-compatible section. Would you like directions? No, Ethan began, then reconsidered as something with tentacles and too many eyes slithered past. Actually, yes. But first, can you give me a quick primer on the, social ecosystem here? The briefing packet was a bit sparse. Certainly, Sevi replied. Varelian 9 is a neutral meeting ground for 247 recognized sapient species, ranging from Class Alpha to Class Omega threat designations. You are currently in the Central Exchange, colloquially known as the trough among station personnel. The trough? As in, where animals feed. Ethan's voice climbed an octave. A regrettable nickname, Sevi admitted, but not entirely inaccurate. This area serves as both diplomatic neutral ground and dining facility. I must advise you to maintain awareness of your surroundings at all times. While violence is strictly prohibited, accidents do occasionally occur. Accidents. Wonderful. Ethan straightened his station-issued jumpsuit and tried to look professional rather than terrified. And what exactly constitutes an Omega threat designation? A subtle alarm tone sounded from Sevi before the AI responded. Omega-class entities possess capabilities that render them potentially existentially dangerous to multiple civilizations. There is currently one such individual aboard Varelian 9. Ethan's eyes widened. There's an existential threat, just hanging out in the cafeteria? Drazal of the Second Maw has diplomatic immunity and has not violated station protocols in 73 standard cycles, Sevi stated with what Ethan thought was just a touch too much forced optimism. However, standard procedure recommends maintaining a minimum safe distance of 20 meters. As if summoned by the mere mention of its name, a ripple of movement spread through the massive hall. Species of all descriptions began to shift, creating a wide berth around something moving toward the center of the room. The crowd parted like a sea before Moses, if Moses had been the living embodiment of interstellar terror. Ethan's first thought was, that can't possibly be a natural evolutionary outcome. His second thought was, asterisk, I should be running. Why are my legs running? Asterisk. Drazal of the Second Maw stood, or perhaps loomed was a better word, at nearly 15 feet tall. Its body resembled a bizarre hybrid of reptile, insect, and something Ethan's brain refused to categorize. Obsidian scales that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it covered most of its form, interrupted occasionally by what appeared to be bioluminescent veins pulsing with an unsettling blue-green glow. Multiple limbs. Ethan counted at least 6, though they seemed to shift and rearrange in ways that defied Euclidean geometry, moved with disturbing grace for something so massive. But it was the face, or rather, faces, that truly cemented Ethan's terror. What appeared to be the primary head housed 3 sets of eyes arranged vertically, each pair a different color, amber, crimson, and ultraviolet that seemed to pierce straight through Ethan's soul. Below those eyes spread the first maw, a mouth filled with teeth arranged in concentric rings, like a lamprey designed by a nightmare factory. The second maw was located in what on a human would be the chest cavity, a horizontal split that occasionally pulsed open, revealing glimpses of something that glowed like magma. As Ethan stood frozen, cataloging details like the good scientist he desperately hoped to remain long enough to be, he realized something even more terrifying than Drazhol's appearance. All 3 pairs of eyes had fixed directly on him. "Sevi," Ethan whispered, his lips barely moving. "Why is the Omega-class existential threat staring at me?" "Unknown," the AI responded, its voice noticeably quieter. Recommendation: initiate slow retreat while maintaining eye contact with the primary visual cluster only. Instead, Ethan found himself stepping forward. Later, when asked to explain this moment of monumentally poor judgment, Ethan would blame it on a combination of jet lag. Did that even apply when traveling by wormhole? Scientific curiosity, and what his mother had always called his problematic lack of self-preservation instincts. Whatever the reason, Ethan Trellick, the smallest sapient in the room by several orders of magnitude, approached Drazhol of the second maw, tablet in hand, already making notes. "Fascinating dermal structure," he said, mostly to himself, but loud enough to be heard in the now silent hall. The scales appeared to function similarly to a non-Newtonian fluid at the macro level, suggesting both defensive capabilities and remarkable sensory perception. "I wonder if the bioluminescent pathways serve as a form of communication or merely as a metabolic byproduct." Drazhol's 3 pairs of eyes blinked in sequence from top to bottom. The second maw pulsed open, then closed. The massive entity bent lower, bringing its primary head to within a few feet of Ethan's face. At this distance, Ethan could smell something like ozone and cinnamon, an impossible combination that made his nose tingle. "You are not fleeing, small one," Drazhol observed, its voice like gravel being crushed beneath tectonic plates. "Are you defective, or simply unaware of what I am?" "Neither, I hope," Ethan replied, surprising himself with his steady tone. "I'm quite aware you're classified as an Omega threat entity capable of ending civilizations. I'm just more interested in the how and why than in running away. Besides, Sevi mentioned you haven't violated protocols in 73 cycles, which suggests a remarkable degree of self-control for a being of your obvious capabilities. That's actually more intriguing to me than the threat designation." The silence in the hall grew deeper, if that was possible. Several beings near the exits began to slowly edge toward them. A crystalline entity actually shattered into component pieces, presumably from stress. And then Drazhol did something that would alter the course of interstellar relations forever. It laughed. The sound was like an avalanche having a seizure, a rumbling, multi-tone cacophony that vibrated through Ethan's bones and probably registered on seismographs several light years away. The second maw opened fully, glowing bright enough to cast shadows. But instead of consuming Ethan, as every other being in the room clearly expected, Drazhol simply straightened up and placed one massive, clawed appendage gently, almost delicately, on Ethan's shoulder. "Little brother," it said, the title resonating with something like affection. "You are either the bravest or the most foolish creature I have encountered in 17 millennia. Perhaps both. I find this refreshing." Throughout the hall, various translation devices sparked, smoked, or simply gave up and shut down. The linguistic and cultural algorithms simply couldn't process what had just happened. Drazhol of the second maw, devourer of star systems and negotiator of extinction-level treaties, had just claimed kinship with a human. Sebi's pleasant voice returned, now distinctly strained. Human Ethan Trellick, this interaction falls outside established protocols. Please verify your status. I'm fine, Ethan replied, still making notes on his tablet. Actually, I'm better than fine. This is incredible data. Drazhol, would you mind if I ask you a few questions about your species' social structures and how they translate to interspecies interactions? Your use of the kinship term little brother is particularly fascinating given our obvious physiological differences. Somewhere in the room, something that sounded expensive crashed to the floor. A high-pitched keening began, possibly a security alarm, or possibly just some poor being having a complete psychological breakdown. Drazhol's primary head tilted to one side, a gesture so unexpectedly. Human like that, Ethan had to resist the urge to laugh. You wish to study me? Not flee from me or petition for protection. Well, if you're offering to be a research subject, that would be amazing, Ethan said, already mentally revising his thesis statement. Though I should mention I'm here to study cross-species social dynamics in general, not just you specifically. No offense intended. None taken, little brother, Drazhol rumbled, and the second maw pulsed with what Ethan was beginning to suspect was amusement. Your species continues to confound expectations. Come, let us converse elsewhere. The others will need time to recalibrate their threat assessments. As Drazhol guided Ethan toward one of the massive doorways, Sebi's voice followed them, now definitely glitching. Human Ethan Trellick, this course of action is not recommended. Please RRR return to established protocols. Error. Relationship parameter undefined. Error. Threat assessment contradiction detected. Initiating diagnostic sequence. Ethan couldn't help but feel a twinge of sympathy for the AI. After all, he was pretty sure he'd just broken the universe's social order in less than 15 minutes on the job. There had to be some kind of record. Behind them, the central exchange exploded into a cacophony of voices, movements, and what Ethan assumed were various species versions of gossip. He caught fragments of translated conversations, clearly a special operative with concealed weaponry. Perhaps humans are immune to Drazhol's psychic field. Maybe it's like those small remora fish that clean the teeth of predators on primitive worlds. Drazhol's multi-toned chuckle rippled through the air. They seek to categorize what they do not understand, little brother. It is the way of thinking beings throughout the cosmos. Few consider that the answer might simply be unexpected friendship. Ethan looked up, way up, at the massive entity beside him and grinned. You know, where I come from, I'm the one who usually has to look up to meet someone's eyes. This is a nice change of pace. And for the second time that day, Drazhol of the second maw laughed, sending ripples of confusion throughout Varelian, 9 Station, and beginning what would later be known as the Human Protocol Crisis. The days following Ethan's arrival at Varelian, 9 were characterized by what the station's diplomatic corps delicately termed social recalibration. In practice, this meant Ethan couldn't go anywhere without causing a minor incident. His morning routine typically began with a visit to the station's approximate version of a coffee shop, a culinary exchange where various species could sample xenogastronomic delights in carefully controlled environments. Ethan's insistence on consuming actual coffee, shipped at extraordinary expense from Earth, rather than the nutritionally optimized substitute recommended for humans, had already marked him as eccentric. The fact that you willingly ingest a known psychoactive stimulant derived from roasted plant seeds continues to intrigue me. Little brother, Drazhol commented one morning, watching Ethan savor his first cup. The massive entity had taken to joining Ethan for his morning ritual, much to the distress of the establishment's other patrons. It's not just about the caffeine, Ethan explained, closing his eyes as he inhaled the aromatic steam. It's comfort, tradition, and, let's be honest, mild addiction all rolled into one delicious package. Your species embraces controlled toxicity as a cultural cornerstone, Drazhol observed. This explains much about human history. Ethan nearly spat out his coffee laughing. That's possibly the most accurate summary of humanity I've ever heard. A hush fell over the already quiet establishment as other patrons observed this exchange. The sight of Varelian Nine's most feared resident engaging in casual banter with its smallest occupant defied all social prediction models. Even more confounding was how Ethan treated Drashol, not with the ritualized deference or carefully calculated politeness that others employed, but with the casual familiarity one might show an eccentric uncle. Dr. Trellick called a melodious voice from across the room. "Might I have a moment of your time?" The speaker was a Floxian ambassador, a vaguely humanoid being with silvery skin and a head that branched into 3 distinct sensory clusters. Floxians were known for their diplomatic skill and cultural adaptability, making them ideal intermediaries in the complex social ecosystem of the station. "Of course, Ambassador Nyleth," Ethan replied, gesturing to the empty seat at his table. Empty except for the fact that it was directly across from Drashol. The ambassador hesitated visibly before gliding forward with practiced grace. "Perhaps somewhere more private would be appropriate for our conversation." "Nonsense," Ethan said cheerfully. "Drashol and I were just discussing the cultural significance of mild toxins in human social rituals. You're welcome to join us." That is, the ambassador's voice modulation faltered momentarily. "Very well, Dr. Trellick, there is growing concern among the diplomatic council regarding your unconventional approach to station protocols. Is there a specific protocol I've violated?" Ethan asked, genuinely curious. He'd reviewed the station's rulebook thoroughly. It was shorter than expected, mostly because after a certain point, most rules boiled down to don't antagonize beings who could vaporize you with a thought. Not violated, precisely. Nyleth's central sensory cluster pulsed with what Ethan had learned to recognize as discomfort. Rather, you have consistently operated outside expected behavioral parameters for a being of your station. You mean because I'm small, fragile, and from a relatively young spacefaring civilization, I should be cowering in the corners and speaking only when spoken to? Ethan took another sip of coffee. That would make for some really boring research papers. Drashol's second maw pulsed open and closed in what Ethan now recognized as silent laughter. "Your association with Class Omega entities without proper security clearance is unprecedented," Nyleth continued, pointedly not looking at Drashol. "I wasn't aware I needed security clearance to have breakfast with a friend," Ethan replied mildly. The word friend caused a visible ripple effect through the ambassador's silvery skin. "Dr. Trellick, perhaps you fail to understand the political implications of—" "Ambassador," Drashol interrupted, its resonant voice causing nearby dishware to vibrate. "Your concern is noted. However, little brother has shown wisdom that belies his species' youth. He sees beyond labels and classifications to the truth of beings. This is a rare gift in our fractured cosmos." Nyleth's 3 sensory clusters rotated in different directions, the Floxian equivalent of extreme distress. "Honor Drashol. With all due respect, the human's behavior sets a concerning precedent. Already, other small species are displaying reduced caution around apex entities. Just yesterday, a Vorgelian researcher attempted to engage a Chronaxian devastator in conversation about poetry. Poetry. Ethan couldn't help himself. "And how did it go?" The devastator recited 17 stanzas of classical Chronaxian verse before returning to its quarters in emotional distress. Its handler reported it spent 3 cycles composing new material. The ambassador's voice had climbed several octaves. "That sounds like a positive cross-cultural exchange to me," Ethan observed, finishing his coffee. Perhaps the devastator had always wanted to share its artistic side, but never felt it had permission within the rigid social hierarchy of the station. Nyleth's sensory clusters aligned in the Floxian expression of exasperation. "Dr. Trellick, the stable operation of this station depends on predictable behavioral patterns among its residents. Your disruptive influence threatens that stability. Change often appears as disruption before it reveals itself as progress." Drashol rumbled philosophically. "Exactly. Ethan agreed, standing up and gathering his tablet. Now, if you'll excuse us, Ambassador, Drazhol has agreed to show me the quantum engineering section. Did you know he has 3 advanced degrees in theoretical physics? Apparently, destroying star systems requires a solid understanding of how they work in the first place. As Ethan and Drazhol departed, leaving a thoroughly discombobulated ambassador behind, Sebi's voice followed them through the corridor. Human Ethan Trellick, a notification has been registered in your file. The Diplomatic Council requests your presence at the next General Assembly to discuss protocol adjustments in light of unexpected variables. Would you like me to accept on your behalf? Might as well, Ethan sighed. Though I suspect unexpected variables is diplomatic speak for that weird human who doesn't know his place. They fear what they cannot categorize, little brother, Drazhol said, its massive form somehow navigating the station corridors with surprising delicacy. Your species' defining trait appears to be your resistance to simple classification. That, and our unfortunate tendency to poke dangerous things with sticks just to see what happens, Ethan added with a grin. The quantum engineering section was less crowded than the public areas of the station, populated mainly by specialized technical workers and the occasional security drone. As they entered, Ethan noticed an immediate change in atmosphere, not just the expected wariness at Drazhol's presence, but something more urgent. A cluster of beings surrounded a central console where holographic displays flickered with alarming patterns of red and amber. A tall, spindly entity with multiple eye stalks was gesticulating frantically at the displays while 2 technicians of different species worked feverishly at the controls. Quantum core destabilization in progress, announced Sevi's voice, now broadcasting throughout the section. Non-essential personnel, please proceed to evacuation points. Temporal distortion protocols in effect. Well, that doesn't sound good, Ethan remarked, already moving closer to the commotion rather than toward the clearly marked evacuation routes. Drazhol followed, causing several technicians to nearly trip over themselves getting out of the way. The containment field is collapsing, shouted the spindly being, its eye stalks wobbling in distress. We need to shut down the core before the cascade becomes irreversible. If you shut it down now, you'll trigger the very collapse you're trying to prevent, countered one of the technicians, a bulbous entity with manipulator tendrils flying over the controls. The harmonic resonance is already outside standard parameters. Ethan stepped forward, eyes rapidly scanning the holographic displays. His specialty might be xenosociology, but like most scientists of his generation, he had a solid foundation in quantum mechanics. It was practically a prerequisite for interstellar travel. "Excuse me," he said, raising his voice to be heard over the increasingly urgent alarms. But has anyone tried to match the field oscillation to the destabilization pattern rather than fighting against it? All activity ceased as multiple alien faces turned toward him, expressions ranging from surprise to outright indignation. "Human," the spindly chief engineer said, pronouncing the word as if it was synonymous with bacterium. "This is a Class A quantum core operating on principles your species has barely begun to theorize about. Please proceed to the evacuation point immediately." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "With all due respect, I can read data patterns regardless of the technology generating them. And that," he pointed to a pulsing waveform on one of the displays, "is clearly showing a self-reinforcing resonance cascade that's being exacerbated by your containment protocols, not mitigated by them." "Preposterous," the engineer scoffed, though one of its eye stalks remained fixed on the display Ethan had indicated. "The standard procedure for quantum instability is to increase containment and prepare for emergency shutdown. Unless the instability is originating from within the containment field itself," Ethan countered, "then you're essentially trapping the problem and forcing it to grow exponentially. It's like trying to contain a fire by sealing it in an oxygen-rich environment." Drazhol, who had been silently observing, suddenly spoke. "The little brother's analysis has merit. The waveform characteristics suggest an internal catalyzation process rather than external degradation. The fact that Drazhol, feared throughout multiple star systems, but also, apparently, well-versed in quantum physics, was supporting Ethan's assessment caused visible confusion among the engineering team. Even if that were true, the chief engineer said, iStock's now quivering with what Ethan recognized as the universal sign of someone who knows they're wrong but can't admit it. The established protocols are clear. We must follow procedure. While the station tears itself apart at the quantum level, Ethan moved closer to the control panel. Look, the resonance pattern is already showing signs of temporal dilation. If that spreads to the inhabited sections of the station, catastrophic chronological displacement detected in sectors 7 through 12, SEBI announced, as if on cue. Evacuation order upgraded to mandatory. Repeat, all personnel must evacuate immediately. Wonderful timing, SEBI, Ethan muttered before turning back to the engineers. We need to try something different. Fust, what do you propose, human? The chief engineer's tone remained dismissive, but there was a new note of desperation beneath it. Ethan quickly assessed the control systems. We need to synchronize with the destabilization pattern, essentially ride the wave rather than fight it. Once we're in harmony with the fluctuations, we can gradually guide it back to stable parameters. That's completely counter to all established. Do you have a better idea that doesn't end with us scattered across multiple timelines? Ethan interrupted. When no answer came, he nodded. Right. I'll need direct access to the core's quantum state modulators. That's impossible, one of the technicians objected. The security protocols. Override protocols. Drashul rumbled, stepping forward. Emergency authorization. Drashul, code Omega-73. The control panel immediately reconfigured, displays shifting to show deeper access levels. The engineering team stared in collective shock. You have an emergency override? The chief engineer sputtered. Since when? Since the station's construction, Drashul replied calmly. Did you truly believe an entity of my classification would be permitted aboard without certain contingencies in place? Now, assist little brother or remove yourselves from our path. What followed was 17 minutes of the most unorthodox quantum engineering ever witnessed on Varelian 9. Ethan, guided by intuition and a solid theoretical foundation, essentially spoke to the quantum core through its own fluctuations, using methods that had several of the traditional engineers covering their visual organs in horror. At one point, he actually disconnected two supposedly critical safety systems, rerouted power through an auxiliary cooling mechanism, and, to the utter disbelief of everyone present, applied what appeared to be adhesive tape from his personal toolkit to secure a temporary bypass connection. Is that primitive physical bonding material? The chief engineer asked, aghast. We call it duct tape, Ethan replied without looking up. Never leave Earth without it. NASA taught us that. Drashul, rather than interfering, took on the role of translator and defender, explaining Ethan's more unorthodox methods to the bewildered engineers while simultaneously ensuring no one attempted to forcibly remove him from the controls. His approach treats the quantum core not as a machine to be commanded, Drashul explained to the increasingly fascinated technical team, but as a complex system to be persuaded. Observe how he matches input parameters to emergent patterns rather than imposing predetermined solutions. It's like coaxing a cat into its carrier instead of forcing it. Ethan added, fingers flying over controls. The more you push, the more it resists. But offer the right incentives in the right sequence. Gradually, the angry red warnings began to shift toward amber, then yellow, and finally a calm blue as the quantum core's oscillation stabilized. The temporal distortion warnings ceased, replaced by SEBI's announcement of quantum stability restored. Emergency protocols deactivated. Engineering teams, please prepare incident reports. As the immediate crisis subsided, Ethan stepped back from the controls, suddenly aware of the complete silence that had fallen over the engineering section. Dozens of alien eyes, or various sensory organs serving similar functions, were fixed on him with expressions ranging from disbelief to grudging respect. That, said the chief engineer finally, all eye stalks now focused intently on Ethan, was not in the protocol manual. Ethan shrugged. Sometimes the manual needs a new chapter. The quantum instability was contained using adhesive strips and power rerouting that violates 17 safety regulations. One of the technicians noted, their voice a mixture of horror and admiration. And cat psychology, Ethan added helpfully. Don't forget that part. I must update my assessment of human problem-solving methodologies, the chief engineer admitted. Your approach was unexpectedly effective. High praise indeed, Drazhol rumbled, the second maw pulsing with amusement. Perhaps now you understand why I find little brother so fascinating. His species approaches problems from angles that our more established civilizations have long forgotten to consider. As they left the engineering section, Ethan couldn't help but notice that the looks directed his way had shifted subtly. There was still wariness, still confusion, but something new had been added to the mix. Curiosity. You know, he said to Drazhol as they made their way back toward the residential sections, I think I just violated about a dozen cultural taboos and engineering traditions in one go. Indeed, Drazhol agreed, and in doing so, prevented a catastrophic failure that conventional methods would have exacerbated. An interesting data point for your research, would you not agree? Ethan grinned. Absolutely. I think I'll title this section of my paper, When Reality Sends You Fractures, Make Origami. Drazhol's rumbling laugh echoed through the corridors, sending a small maintenance drone scurrying for cover. Your species' way with words continues to delight me, little brother. I begin to understand why your Shakespeare is studied even in the furthest reaches of the Seventh Dominion. As they reached Ethan's quarters, Sevi's voice interrupted once more. Human Ethan Trellick, your presence at tomorrow's Diplomatic Council session has been upgraded from requested to required. The agenda has been expanded to include discussion of non-standard resolution methodologies in crisis situations. Translation: they want to figure out if I'm a genius or a dangerous lunatic. Ethan sighed. Perhaps both, Drazhol suggested. In my experience, the two are not mutually exclusive. Ethan couldn't help but laugh. Coming from an Omega-class existential threat, I'll take that as a compliment. The Diplomatic Council Chamber of Varelian 9 was designed to accommodate beings of vastly different physiologies, environmental needs, and psychological comfort zones. The result was a space that resembled a bizarre hybrid of a United Nations General Assembly, an aquarium complex, and a multi-level terrarium. Various atmospheric containment fields, gravity adjusters, and temperature regulators ensured that a methane-breathing crystalline entity could comfortably sit or hover or undulate, mere meters away from an oxygen-dependent mammaloid without either experiencing distress. Today, however, the chamber was more crowded than usual. Word had spread about the human who had both befriended Drazhol of the Second Maw and averted a quantum catastrophe using methods that defied conventional wisdom. Representatives from species that rarely bothered with diplomatic proceedings had suddenly discovered an intense interest in protocol discussions. Ethan, seated at a small desk that made him feel like he was back in elementary school, tried not to fidget as various council members discussed him as if he wasn't present. Clearly represents an anomalous case that requires specialized containment protocols, argued a gaseous entity contained within a hovering metallic sphere. Demonstrated problem-solving capabilities that, while unorthodox, proved effective in a crisis situation, countered a being that resembled an ambulatory coral reef. Potential security risk due to unpredictable behavioral patterns and disregard for established hierarchies, insisted a tall, insectoid creature with gleaming mandibles. Ambassador Nyleth, serving as moderator, raised all three sensory clusters for attention. We must remember that despite his species' relative youth in interstellar affairs, Dr. Trellick is a credentialed researcher whose expertise in cross-species social dynamics was deemed valuable enough to warrant his position here. Perhaps we should actually ask for his perspective rather than merely discussing him in the third person. A murmur ran through the assembly, some supportive, others clearly disapproving of this radical suggestion to actually include the subject of discussion in the conversation. Thank you, Ambassador, Ethan said, standing. I appreciate the opportunity to address the council directly. Dr. Trellick, Nihilith began formally. How would you respond to concerns that your unconventional approaches pose a potential disruption to the carefully balanced social ecosystem of Aurelia 9? Ethan considered his words carefully. Despite his reputation for impulsivity, he understood the importance of this moment. Honorable representatives, I believe what you're perceiving as disruption is actually adaptation. Complex systems, whether quantum cores or social structures, require flexibility to remain resilient. Rigid adherence to protocols without room for innovation leads to eventual system failure. Are you suggesting that the diplomatic and security protocols developed over centuries by hundreds of advanced civilizations are flawed? The insectoid representative's mandibles clicked in what Ethan recognized as irritation. Not flawed, incomplete, Ethan clarified. They were designed based on historical patterns of interaction. But new variables, like humans, require system updates, not just error messages. A ripple of what might have been amusement passed through some sections of the chamber. And your association with Drazhul of the Second Maw pressed a serpentine entity coiled around a gravity-defying perch. How do you explain forming a social bond with an entity classified as an existential threat? I approached Drazhul as a person, not as a classification, Ethan replied simply. And in return, I was treated as a person, not as a potential prey item or political pawn. It turns out mutual respect transcends biological differences. A charming but simplistic view, said the Serpentine counselor. Drazhul species has eradicated entire civilizations. Its presence here is tolerated only through complex treaties and containment protocols. With respect, Counselor, Ethan countered, perhaps those civilizations never tried talking to Drazhul before attempting to contain or control it. Sometimes the most dangerous thing about a being is how others choose to perceive and treat it. Before the council could respond to this philosophical grenade, an urgent alert tone sounded throughout the chamber. Sevi's voice followed, unusually clipped. Priority alert. Spatial anomaly detected in Central Exchange. All diplomatic personnel remain in secure locations. Security teams responding. The chamber erupted into a cacophony of voices, some demanding more information, others calling for immediate evacuation procedures. Ambassador Nihilith raised all sensory clusters again, calling for order. Sevi, detailed status report, Nihilith commanded. Spatial tear detected in Central Exchange, origin unknown. Current size, 2 meters and expanding. Temporal readings inconsistent with standard. Spacetime, containment teams en route. Estimated arrival in 3 minutes. Ethan was already on his feet, tablet in hand. I need to see this. Dr. Trellick, the alert specifically instructed all personnel to remain in secure locations. Nihilith objected. I'm a researcher, Ambassador. This is literally what I'm here to study. Unexpected phenomena and how different species respond to them. Ethan was already moving toward the exit. Besides, if it's anything like the quantum core incident, standard containment protocols might just make things worse. Human, this is not your jurisdiction, the insectoid counselor called after him. Ethan paused at the doorway. No offense, counselor, but neither was the quantum core. Didn't stop me from saving all our collective anatomies, did it? Before anyone could formulate a response to this admittedly valid point, Ethan was gone, sprinting through the corridors toward the Central Exchange. Behind him, he heard the council chamber dissolve into chaos as different factions argued over the appropriate response. What Ethan didn't expect was to hear massive footsteps rapidly gaining on him from behind. He glanced back to see Drazhul, all 15 feet of terrifying alien majesty, moving with surprising speed through the corridor. Little brother, Drazhul called, not even slightly out of breath despite its rapid pace. Your tendency to run toward danger rather than away from it continues to fascinate me. It's a human thing, Ethan panted as Drazhul caught up. Curiosity, simultaneously our greatest strength, and the reason we keep nearly going extinct. They reached the central exchange to find it in a state of controlled chaos. Security drones formed a perimeter around what could only be described as a tear in reality, a jagged, vertical rent in the air itself, edges shifting and pulsing with colors that hurt Ethan's eyes to look at directly. Around the perimeter, various technical staff huddled over equipment, taking readings and shouting increasingly alarmed assessments at each other. Spatial integrity decreasing by 7% per minute. Chronometric distortion exceeding measurement capabilities. Containment field ineffective. The anomaly is simply incorporating it into its structure. At the center of this activity stood a tall, slender being with metallic skin and 4 arms, each manipulating different pieces of equipment simultaneously. Ethan recognized Dr. Zenth, the station's chief theoretical physicist, whose papers on transdimensional mathematics had been required reading during Ethan's preparation for this assignment. Dr. Zenth, Ethan called, approaching the perimeter. What are we looking at here? The physicist turned, all 4 eyes blinking in sequence. Dr. Trellick? You should not be here. This is a Class 7 spatial anomaly with potential dimensional breach characteristics. Yes, I can see that, Ethan replied, studying the tier with open fascination. But what I'm asking is, what is it doing? Zenth's eyes blinked again, this time out of sequence, a sign of confusion. It is tearing the fabric of space-time. What else would it be doing? Well, for starters, it's expanding in a consistently patterned way, Ethan observed, pointing at the edges of the anomaly. Look at the oscillation. It's not random. There's a structure to it. That is merely an artifact of our containment attempts. Zenth dismissed. The one set of arms paused in their work. I don't think so, Ethan said, pulling up analytical software on his tablet. If I'm reading these ambient energy patterns correctly, the anomaly is responding to your containment measures, not being affected by them. Almost as if it's communicating. Preposterous, Zenth stated flatly. Spatial anomalies do not communicate. Why not? Ethan challenged. Just because we've never encountered one that doesn't mean it's impossible. The universe keeps reminding us that impossible usually just means outside our current understanding. Before Zenth could respond, a new voice joined the conversation, one that carried immediate authority. Cease containment procedures immediately. All activity around the anomaly halted as High Counselor Vexalia, the station's ultimate authority on security matters, strode into the exchange. The counselor, a tall humanoid with skin like polished obsidian and eyes that glowed with inner light, surveyed the scene with the calm efficiency of someone who had dealt with countless crises. Counselor, Zenth protested, with all respect, if we do not contain this breach, it could potentially expand to consume the entire station. If it intended to consume the station, Vexalia replied coolly, it would have done so already. Our readings indicate it has more than sufficient energy to overcome our barriers. Yet it restrains itself, maintaining a consistent size despite our provocations. Ethan couldn't help but smile. The counselor had come to the same conclusion he had, but from a strategic rather than scientific perspective. Exactly, he agreed. It's showing remarkable control. This isn't a random tear, it's deliberate. Vexalia's glowing eyes shifted to Ethan, narrowing slightly. Dr. Trellick, I might have known you would be present. Your tendency to appear at the center of unusual events is becoming something of a station-wide pattern. Just lucky, I guess, Ethan replied with a shrug. Or perhaps you possess insight that our more traditional approaches lack, the counselor suggested, surprising Ethan with what sounded suspiciously like approval. What does your unorthodox perspective make of this phenomenon? All eyes turned to Ethan, including the unsettling triple pairs belonging to Drazhul, who had maintained a watchful position behind him. I think, Ethan said slowly, studying the pulsating patterns of the anomaly, that it's trying to talk to us. But our containment methods are like shouting over someone who's trying to speak. If we want to understand it, we need to listen first. Listen? To a spatial tear. Zenth scoffed. And how do you propose we do that? Invite it to tea. Not tea, Ethan replied, already pulling equipment from his pockets. But we could try to match its oscillation patterns, create a harmonic resonance that acknowledges its presence without trying to suppress it. That is precisely the opposite of standard containment protocols, Zenth objected, which haven't been working, Vexalia pointed out. Dr. Trellick, what would you need to attempt this? Communication? Ethan quickly assessed the equipment around him. I'll need a quantum field modulator, access to the station's main sensor array, and, he paused, looking slightly embarrassed, my coffee maker for my quarters. There was a moment of stunned silence before someone in the back of the crowd broke into what might have been laughter, quickly stifled. Your coffee maker, Vexalia repeated, her tone perfectly neutral. It has a specific oscillation pattern when brewing that creates a harmonic resonance at exactly the frequency this anomaly seems to be fluctuating at, Ethan explained. Plus, I modified it to boost the signal from my quantum communicator. Long story, but basically it can help amplify the modulation patterns we're going to need. Vexalia stared at him for a long moment before turning to a nearby security officer. Retrieve Dr. Trellick's coffee-making device. Immediately, what followed was perhaps the strangest attempt at cross-dimensional communication in recorded history. Using a hastily assembled array of standard scientific equipment, Ethan's modified coffee maker, and, to the continuing disbelief of the assembled experts, a small frequency modulator he had apparently constructed from spare parts and what looked suspiciously like more duct tape, Ethan established what he claimed was a harmonic dialogue with the spatial anomaly. The key is matching its fundamental frequency, but introducing micro-variations that mirror natural communication patterns, he explained as he worked, seemingly oblivious to the mixture of skepticism and fascination surrounding him. Think of it like humming along with a song, but occasionally changing notes to ask a question. Drazhul, rather than remaining a passive observer, had positioned itself directly between Ethan and the anomaly, its massive form providing both protection and, Ethan suspected, intimidation should the tear prove less benign than he believed. The pattern is responding, one of the sensor technicians announced, surprise evident in their voice. The tear's fluctuation is shifting to match our output. It's working, Ethan confirmed, adjusting settings on his makeshift array. Now let's try a simple mathematical sequence. Prime numbers are usually a good start for establishing a universal language. For nearly an hour, Ethan conversed with the spatial tear through patterns of energy and mathematical sequences. The assembled scientists gradually moved from skepticism to cautious interest as the anomaly clearly responded to the communications, changing its configuration and energy output in ways that could not be dismissed as random. It's not just responding, Ethan announced finally, looking up from his instruments with an expression of wonder. It's asking questions, complex ones about our dimensional constraints and perceptual limits. How can you possibly know that? Zenth demanded, though the physicist's tone had shifted from dismissive to intensely curious. Because it's showing us, Ethan replied, pointing to the tear, which had now reformed into a complex, geometric pattern that pulsed with ordered sequences of light. That's not random visual noise. It's a multidimensional representation model. It's trying to explain itself to us. If I'm interpreting these energy patterns correctly, one of the senior technicians added, the anomaly isn't a tear at all. It's more like a window or a probe. Exactly, Ethan agreed. It's not trying to invade or consume. It's trying to observe and understand. We just weren't speaking the right language to recognize its attempts at communication. High Counselor Vexalia, who had been silently observing the proceedings, stepped forward. Can you determine its origin or purpose? Ethan adjusted several settings, studied the results, and nodded slowly. From what I can gather, it's a sort of research tool from a civilization that exists in a dimensional state perpendicular to our own. They're as curious about us as we are about them, but our methods of containment registered as hostility in their perceptual framework. Are you suggesting, Vexalia said carefully, that we nearly started an interdimensional incident because we failed to recognize a scientific survey when we saw one? That's a pretty accurate summary, yes, Ethan admitted. The High Counselor was silent for a moment before turning to address the assembled staff. Protocol adjustments are clearly required. Dr. Trellick, please continue your conversation. Inform our visitors that we apologize for the misunderstanding and would welcome proper scientific exchange under controlled circumstances. As Ethan turned back to his unusual communication array, he caught Drazhol observing him with all 3 pairs of eyes focused intently. You knew, didn't you? Ethan asked quietly. That it wasn't a threat? I suspected, Drazhol admitted, the second maw pulsing gently. My species has encountered similar phenomena, but it is one thing to recognize a pattern and quite another to know how to respond to it. You, little brother, have just taught me something new about diplomacy. Me? Teaching an ancient cosmic entity about diplomacy. Ethan laughed. That has to be a first. The first of many, I suspect, Drazhol replied. Your species approaches problems without the burden of 10,000 years of established procedure. It is refreshingly direct. Over the next few hours, Ethan established what could best be described as a scientific dialogue with the dimensional anomaly, learning that it was indeed a research probe from civilization existing in what they called the perpendicular reality, a dimension that intersected with our universe but operated according to different physical laws. By the time the anomaly finally closed, not violently or suddenly, but with a deliberate, almost courteous dimming of its energies, Ethan had arranged for future communications, exchanged basic mathematical and physical constants, and even set up what might be the first interdimensional research collaboration in recorded history. As the last traces of the anomaly faded, the central exchange erupted into a flurry of activity. Scientists rushing to analyze data, security personnel standing down from alert status, and various officials huddling to discuss the implications. Through it all, Ethan stood next to his improvised communication array, a small, satisfied smile on his face. You enjoyed that, didn't you, little brother? Drazhol observed. Is it that obvious? Ethan grinned. To one who has learned to read human expressions, yes. Your species displays emotion with remarkable transparency. Well, it's not every day you get to be the first person to have a conversation with an entirely different dimension of reality, Ethan said. Plus, I just guaranteed my research funding for the next decade at minimum. High Counselor Vex'ahlia approached them, her glowing eyes fixed on Ethan with an intensity that would have been unsettling if not for the slight upward curve of her mouth, what passed for a smile in her species. Dr. Trellick, she said formally, the Council will require a full report on this incident, including your methodology and all data collected during the exchange. Of course, Counselor. Happy to provide it. Additionally, she continued, I am instituting what will henceforth be known as the human clause in our emergency protocols. Ethan blinked in surprise. The human clause? When standard procedures fail, Vex'ahlia explained, and conventional wisdom proves inadequate, consult Dr. Ethan Trellick. Or, in his absence, apply methodologies that defy traditional constraints. You're kidding, Ethan said, then quickly added, I mean, that's an honor, Counselor, but surely. I do not kid, Doctor. Vex'ahlia's tone was dry. This station has faced 2 potentially catastrophic events in a short time since your arrival. In both cases, your unconventional approaches succeeded where our established protocols would have failed. It would be illogical not to incorporate this lesson into our future planning. With that, she departed, leaving Ethan momentarily speechless, a rare condition for him. I believe, Drazhol rumbled beside him, obvious amusement in its multi-toned voice, that you have just been officially designated as the station's chaos solution specialist. That's not a real job title, Ethan protested. Perhaps it should be, Drazhol replied. After all, little brother, chaos seems to both follow and obey you in equal measure. As they left the central exchange, Ethan couldn't help but notice the changed way station personnel regarded him. The wariness remained, but it was now tempered with something new, a grudging respect, or perhaps simple curiosity. Even Sevi's voice seemed different when it addressed him. Human Ethan Trellick, your presence is requested in Laboratory Section 42B, at your convenience. Several research teams have expressed interest in discussing alternative methodological frameworks with you. Translation: they want to know how a primitive human managed to talk to another dimension using a coffee maker and duct tape. Ethan sighed. Your species' ingenuity deserves recognition, Drashol observed. Perhaps now they will begin to understand why I chose to call you brother rather than prey. Ethan glanced up at the massive entity beside him. I've been meaning to ask about that. Why little brother? Of all the terms you could have used, why that one? All three pairs of Drashol's eyes focused on him, and the second maw pulsed with what Ethan had come to recognize as thoughtfulness. Because, Ethan Trellick, in the 17 millennia of my existence, I have learned that there are two kinds of beings in this universe. Those who seek to destroy what they fear, and those who seek to understand it. The massive entity's primary head tilted slightly. Your kind, despite your fragility and brief lifespans, consistently choose understanding over destruction. This makes you kin to my own philosophy, if not my biology. It was perhaps the longest speech Ethan had heard from Drashol, and certainly the most personal. For once, he found himself without an immediate quip or clever response. Thanks, he said finally. That means a lot. Do not become sentimental, little brother, Drashol rumbled, the second maw pulsing with amusement again. I still find your species bizarre in many respects. Your insistence on consuming beverages that alter your consciousness, your attachment to impermanent social bonds, your peculiar fascination with creating art that depicts things that do not exist. Hey, science fiction has predicted a lot of actual technology, Ethan protested with a laugh. Today's fiction is tomorrow's user manual. Perhaps, Drashol conceded, another uniquely human perspective, seeing possibility where others see only fantasy. As they walked through the corridors of Varelia 9, Ethan realized that in just a few short weeks, he had not only adapted to life on an intergalactic station populated by beings from across the cosmos, but had actually begun to change how that station itself operated. The human clause wasn't just about him personally. It represented a shift in thinking, an acknowledgement that sometimes the most valuable perspective is the one that doesn't fit neatly into established categories. You know what I think? Ethan said suddenly. I think this station needed a little chaos. Everything was too orderly, too predictable. Sometimes innovation requires a bit of disruption. A dangerous philosophy, Drashol observed, but not an incorrect one. Evolution itself requires occasional disruption to prevent stagnation. Exactly. And speaking of disruption, Ethan's eyes lit up with the gleam that those who knew him had learned to both fear and anticipate. I've been thinking about setting up a cross-species improvisational problem-solving laboratory. A place where different beings can bring unusual challenges and develop solutions unconstrained by traditional methodologies. You wish to institutionalize chaos, Drashol said, a note of what might have been admiration in its resonant voice. I prefer to think of it as systematizing innovation, Ethan corrected with a grin. And I was hoping you might be willing to participate. Having an Omega-class entity involved would certainly attract attention. Drashol was silent for a moment, all three pairs of eyes blinking in sequence. You continue to surprise me, little brother. Most beings would seek to minimize their association with one such as me. You wish to formalize it. Well, you're basically the station's walking nuclear deterrent, Ethan pointed out pragmatically. Nobody's going to mess with a project that has Drashol of the Second Maw as a contributor. A calculating perspective, Drashol noted. Perhaps there's hope for your species' survival after all. I'll take that as a yes, Ethan laughed. By the time they reached Ethan's quarters, word of the dimensional conversation had spread throughout the station. His communication terminal was blinking with dozens of messages from various scientific departments, diplomatic envoys, and, somewhat worryingly, several military attachés from different stellar nations. Looks like I'm going to be popular for a while, Ethan observed. Fame is a double-edged sword, little brother, Drashol warned. Not all attention is beneficial. I know, Ethan sighed. But think of the research opportunities. Cross-dimensional communication, non-standard problem-solving methodologies, the evolution of protocol systems in response to novel variables. His eyes gleamed with scholarly enthusiasm. This could reshape our understanding of interspecies dynamics. Your passion for knowledge outweighs your sense of self-preservation, Drashol observed. A common trait among the greatest minds and the most troublesome ones. I'll take that as a compliment, Ethan grinned. As it was intended, Drashol replied, the second maw pulsing with what Ethan now recognized as genuine affection. As Drashol departed, promising to return for their now-established morning coffee ritual, Sevi's voice addressed Ethan once more. Human Ethan Trellick, new station-wide protocols have been implemented. Security alert level, yellow. Temporal distortion detection, enhanced. Coffee maker monitoring, activated. Ethan laughed out loud. You're monitoring my coffee maker now, Sevi? All potential interdimensional communication devices are now subject to enhanced observation. The AI replied with what Ethan could have sworn was a hint of humor. Additionally, I have been instructed to alert security personnel if you are observed smiling at your tablet for extended periods. Now that's just discriminatory, Ethan protested, still laughing. The Diplomatic Council deemed it a necessary precaution following statistical analysis of recent incidents, Sevi explained. You are 73% more likely to engage in protocol-defying behavior after periods of what Dr. Zenth termed ominous human idea generation. I'll have to work on my poker face, Ethan mused, already making notes on his tablet about the social implications of species-specific behavioral monitoring. As he prepared for sleep that night, or what passed for night on a space station with entirely artificial lighting cycles, Ethan reflected on how thoroughly his life had changed in such a short time. He had come to Varelian 9 to study interspecies social dynamics as an outside observer. Instead, he had become a catalyst for change, a bridge between wildly different perspectives and, strangest of all, the adopted little brother of what was arguably the most dangerous entity in known space. The universe, it seemed, had a sense of humor after all. The Possibility Laboratory, as Ethan's improvisational problem-solving center came to be known, quickly evolved from a theoretical proposal to a functioning reality. Located in a previously underutilized section of the station, the lab became a space where conventional wisdom was checked at the door and innovative thinking was not just encouraged, but required. 3 months after the dimensional anomaly incident, the lab had already developed solutions to 17 previously intractable problems, ranging from a communication protocol for a newly discovered crystalline hive mind to a method for stabilizing wormhole apertures using principles derived from Earth origami techniques. I still failed to comprehend how folding paper models led to a breakthrough in hyperspatial mechanics, admitted Ambassador Nyleth, who had become a surprisingly enthusiastic supporter of the lab after it resolved a centuries-old diplomatic impasse with the Photonic Collective. It's all about recognizing patterns across different scales and dimensions, Ethan explained, demonstrating a complex fold on a sheet of iridescent paper. The mathematics of folding creates relationships between points that exist in the same space but need to be reconfigured into new arrangements without breaking continuity, which is exactly the challenge with stable wormhole apertures. The ambassador's sensory clusters pulsed in what Ethan had learned to recognize as comprehension. Your species thinks in metaphors where mind thinks in axioms. Both approaches have value, but combining them creates something greater than either alone. Exactly, Ethan beamed. That's the whole point of this place, combining perspectives that would never normally intersect. The lab itself reflected this philosophy in its design. Rather than the sterile, regimented environment typical of station research facilities, the Possibility Laboratory was a wonderfully chaotic space where workstations could be reconfigured at a moment's notice, where the walls were covered in notes and diagrams from dozens of different species, some requiring specialized vision to even perceive, and where the traditional hierarchy of senior researchers and assistants had been replaced by a fluid system where anyone could lead a project if they had the best approach. Most striking to visitors, however, was the constant presence of Drashol of the Second Maw, who had become something of a fixture in the lab. The massive entity had proven surprisingly adept at what Ethan called perspective inversion, the ability to completely reframe a problem by shifting the fundamental assumptions underlying it. The difficulty, Drashall explained to a group of awestruck junior researchers, lies not in finding an answer, but in recognizing when you are asking the wrong question. The relationship between Ethan and Drashall had evolved as well. What had begun as a surprising alliance had deepened into something that, while defying easy classification, contained elements of mentorship, friendship, and genuine mutual respect. They still maintained their morning coffee ritual, though it had expanded to include occasional guests brave enough to join the smallest and largest sentients on the station for what had become informally known as Chaos Breakfast. It was during one such breakfast that High Counselor Vex'ahlia made a rare appearance in the public areas of the station, her obsidian features as impassive as ever as she approached their table. Dr. Trellick honored Drashall. She greeted them formally. "I trust the morning finds you both well." "Counselor," Ethan exclaimed, nearly spilling his coffee in surprise. "Please join us. We were just discussing the philosophical implications of transient quantum states as a metaphor for cultural evolution." "A stimulating topic, I'm sure," Vex'ahlia replied, taking the offered seat with grave dignity. "However, I come on a matter of some urgency. The Council has been contacted by representatives of the perpendicular reality you communicated with 3 months ago. They wish to establish formal diplomatic relations." Ethan nearly choked on his coffee. "They what? How? I mean, our communication was rudimentary at best." Nevertheless, they were sufficiently impressed to pursue further contact. Their message specifically requested your involvement as, quote, "the small entity who speaks with borrowed harmonies." "I think they mean the coffee maker," Ethan said, fighting back a laugh. "Indeed," Vex'ahlia replied, her tone dry. "The Council is, understandably, approaching this situation with caution. An interdimensional diplomatic relationship is unprecedented. We would like you to lead the contact team." "Me? I'm not a diplomat. I'm a researcher," Ethan protested. "You are the only being on this station who has successfully communicated with their kind," Vex'ahlia pointed out. "Moreover, your unique problem-solving methodologies seem particularly suited to navigating unfamiliar cultural and conceptual frameworks." "The human clause strikes again," Drashall observed, the second maw pulsing with amusement. "Precisely," Vex'ahlia agreed. "When standard procedures do not exist, we must turn to those who specialize in creating new paths forward." Ethan looked back and forth between the station's highest authority and his improbable friend, the most feared entity in known space. "You're both enjoying this, aren't you? Watching me get roped into increasingly bizarre situations." "Enjoyment is irrelevant," Vex'ahlia stated, though Ethan could have sworn he saw the faintest glimmer of humor in her glowing eyes. "Effectiveness is what matters. And you, Dr. Trellick, have proven repeatedly effective at the impossible." "I will accompany little brother," Drashall announced, the statement clearly not a request, but a simple declaration of fact. "My knowledge of transdimensional entities may prove useful." "The Council anticipated as much," Vex'ahlia nodded. "Preparations are already underway in Central Exchange. The contact is scheduled for tomorrow at Station Standard Time 0800. After the High Counselor departed, Ethan slumped in his chair, staring into his coffee as if it might contain answers to the universe. "How did this happen? I came here to write papers on interspecies social patterns, not become an interdimensional ambassador. The universe rarely conforms to our expectations, little brother," Drashall said philosophically. "Often, we find our true path only when we step off the road we thought we were meant to travel." "That's surprisingly poetic coming from someone with a mouth in their chest," Ethan replied, then immediately grimaced. "Sorry, that was speciesist of me." "On the contrary," Drashall rumbled, the second maw pulsing with what Ethan now confidently identified as laughter, "your irreverence is refreshing. Most beings are so terrified of causing offense that they never speak truth, only careful approximations of it." As they finished their breakfast and prepared to begin planning for the unprecedented diplomatic contact, Sevi's voice addressed the station at large. Attention, all personnel. Protocol update in effect. The human clause has been expanded to include Section 7. Unconventional resource utilization in extraordinary circumstances. Kitchen appliances are no longer classified as low security items. All modified personal electronics must be registered with technical division. I'm never going to live down the coffee maker thing, am I? Ethan sighed. Some legends grow beyond their creators, little brother. Drashol replied sagely. You should be proud. Few beings achieve immortalization in station protocols within their first year of service. When you put it like that, it does sound pretty impressive, Ethan admitted with a grin. Though I'm a little concerned about what the history books will say. Ethan Trellick, the man who revolutionized interdimensional diplomacy with caffeine and adhesive tape. There are worse epitaphs, Drashol observed. Many beings are remembered only for what they destroyed. You will be remembered for what you created, new connections, new understandings, new possibilities. As they walked through the corridors of Aurelian 9, Ethan noticed that the way other beings reacted to their presence had changed dramatically over the months. Where once there had been fear and confusion at the sight of a human casually strolling alongside an Omega-class entity, now there were respectful nods, curious glances, and even the occasional approach from braver individuals with questions or proposals for the possibility laboratory. The station itself seemed different too. More vibrant, more dynamic. Sections that had once been strictly segregated by species now showed signs of integration. Experimental protocols were being tested alongside traditional ones. Ideas were flowing more freely between departments and disciplines. You know, Ethan said thoughtfully as they reached the laboratory, I think we've done more than just solve a few problems. We've started changing how beings from different backgrounds interact with each other. Indeed, Drashol agreed. The human clause has become more than a protocol exception. It has become a philosophy. When barriers seem insurmountable, look for the unexpected path. When differences appear irreconcilable, seek the common ground beneath them. That's it exactly. Ethan nodded enthusiastically. It's about recognizing that diversity isn't just something to be tolerated. It's our greatest strength. Different perspectives, different experiences, different biologies, they all contribute to a more complete understanding of reality. As they entered the possibility laboratory, they found it already bustling with activity despite the early hour. Researchers of various species were gathered around a central holographic display, arguing enthusiastically about dimensional mathematics and communication theory in preparation for tomorrow's historic contact. Drashol observed the scene with all three pairs of eyes, the bioluminescent pathways across its obsidian scales pulsing with what Ethan had learned to recognize as contemplation. When I first called you little brother, Drashol said softly, its resonant voice pitched low enough that only Ethan could hear, I believed I was extending protection to a fragile but interesting creature. I see now that I was mistaken. Oh, Ethan looked up, curious. Yes, Drashol continued, all eyes fixed on the diverse group of beings working together in harmony. I did not protect you. You are changing the universe, one improbable connection at a time. Perhaps it is you who has been protecting us from our own limitations, our own fears, our own rigid thinking. Ethan felt a lump form in his throat at the unexpected sentiment. I don't know what to say to that. Say nothing, Drashol replied. Do what you have always done. Ask questions no one else thinks to ask. Find connections no one else sees. And remind us all that the universe does not require us to be large to make a difference. It only requires us to be curious enough to question and brave enough to answer. As they joined the preparations for the next day's historic first contact, Ethan couldn't help but smile at the strange and wonderful path his life had taken. He had come to Varelian, 9 as the smallest species in the room, intimidated and overwhelmed. Now, he moved through the station with confidence, not because he had grown larger, but because he had helped others see that size was never what mattered most. The universe, it turned out, didn't need another apex predator. It needed someone small enough to see the details others missed, brave enough to question what everyone else accepted, and creative enough to find connections where others saw only differences. It needed, as Drashall had so accurately observed, someone curious enough to ask questions. And sometimes, Ethan reflected as he watched the diverse team of researchers collaborating with enthusiasm and purpose. That was enough to change everything.